Most people think they are paid for the hours they work. They think the paycheck tells the truth. But if you have ever ended a workday too exhausted to cook, too drained to think, and too numb to enjoy the evening you supposedly earned, something already feels off. The numbers say you are doing fine, yet your energy says otherwise. Your bank app shows deposits, but your life feels permanently behind schedule. You work hard, you hit your hours, you do what you were told would lead to stability. And yet, somehow, every month feels like damage control instead of progress. The money comes in, then quietly disappears, leaving you wondering how a decent hourly rate still results in constant pressure. This story is not about laziness. It is not about poor discipline. And it is not about budgeting mistakes. It is about a belief almost everyone accepts without question, a belief so normalized that we stop seeing how much it costs us. Once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Because the problem was never how much you were paid. It was how much of your life that pay quietly consumed. Let's call him Ethan. Ethan believed he had done everything right. He landed a job that paid a little over $30 an hour, the kind of number that sounds impressive when you say it out loud. It was enough to reassure his parents, enough to silence his own doubts, enough to convince himself that the long days were temporary sacrifices for long-term security. Every weekday followed the same rhythm: an early alarm, a rushed morning, a commute spent half awake and already tense. By the time Ethan sat down at his desk, he felt like he had already lived half a day. Still, he told himself this was normal. This was adulthood. This was what being responsible looked like. At work, Ethan was competent and dependable. He stayed late when needed. He answered emails after hours. He kept a mental tally of how much he was earning per hour and used that number as proof that the stress was justified. When the job felt heavy, he reminded himself, at least the pay is good. That belief shaped everything. It explained the expensive lunches grabbed between meetings. It excused the takeout dinners ordered, because cooking felt impossible. It softened the guilt of spending weekends recovering instead of living. The job paid well, so these were acceptable trade-offs, necessary ones even. Over time, the pattern hardened into routine. Ethan did not feel cheated. He felt tired, and he assumed that tiredness was simply the price of making decent money. The belief Ethan carried was simple and widely accepted. If the hourly rate is high enough, the job is worth it. As long as the number looked respectable, everything else became secondary. The long days, the short nights, the constant sense of rushing, all of it was framed as temporary discomfort in exchange for financial security. The paycheck was treated as the final verdict, the proof that the arrangement was fair. But one evening, that belief cracked in a quiet, uncomfortable way. Ethan was sitting at his kitchen table, scrolling through his bank app, trying to understand why his balance felt smaller than it should. The math did not add up in the way he expected. He was earning what most people would call good money, yet he felt perpetually behind. No momentum, no breathing room, just maintenance. That was when the question surfaced, uninvited and unsettling. What if the hourly rate isn't telling the full story? The more he thought about it, the more unstable the belief became. The number on his offer letter assumed that his time started and stopped neatly at the office door. It assumed his energy was infinite, his recovery was free, and his life outside of work cost nothing to maintain. It assumed that the job only claimed the hours it officially paid for. None of that was true. The rate Ethan trusted so deeply was not a measure of value. It was a simplified headline, stripped of context, stripped of cost. And once he saw that, the belief that had justified years of exhaustion stopped feeling solid. It started to feel incomplete, even misleading. Once the belief began to unravel, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Ethan started listing everything the job quietly demanded beyond the paycheck. Not as complaints, but as facts. The taxes that reduced every dollar before it ever reached his account. The commute that burned time and money twice a day. The clothes he wore only because the job required a certain look. The lunches bought because there was no time or energy to prepare food in advance. Then there were the costs no one ever mentioned. The late afternoons where his concentration collapsed and caffeine became a necessity instead of a choice. The evenings spent ordering food instead of cooking, not out of indulgence but exhaustion. The weekends used to recover rather than explore because his energy had already been spent in advance. The most uncomfortable realization came when he thought about what that exhaustion produced. It produced spending, small, frequent purchases that softened the edges of stress, streaming subscriptions to escape, drinks to decompress, impulse buys that felt like rewards for surviving the week. None of these felt reckless on their own. Together, they formed a pattern of quiet leakage. When Ethan added everything up, the picture changed dramatically. His income was not just reduced by taxes, it was eroded by the costs of sustaining the job itself. And the time commitment was larger than he had ever admitted. The mornings, the commute, the mental load carried home, the slow emotional recovery before he could feel like himself again. When he divided what actually remained by the real hours the job consumed, the result was sobering. The impressive hourly rate collapsed into something far smaller. Not because he was bad with money, but because the system had hidden the full cost from him. This was the moment the story stopped being abstract. The numbers were not theoretical anymore. They were a mirror, and they were uncomfortable to look at. What Ethan was experiencing was not unusual. In fact, it was painfully common. Most people never calculate their work this way. They are taught to look at income in isolation, as if it exists separate from the life required to earn it. The paycheck becomes the focus, while the surrounding costs fade into the background, accepted as normal side effects of being employed. This is why so many people feel confused by their own finances. They earn more than they did years ago, yet feel no lighter. Promotions arrive, but relief does not follow. The lifestyle expands just enough to absorb the increase, while the exhaustion deepens. From the outside, it looks like progress. From the inside, it feels like running in place. The system depends on this misunderstanding. It benefits when people measure success by gross numbers instead of lived reality. As long as the salary sounds good, the hidden trade-offs remain unexamined. Time is exchanged without being priced. Energy is spent without being counted. Recovery becomes a personal problem instead of a structural cost. If Ethan's story feels familiar, it is because many people are living versions of it simultaneously. Different jobs, different pay rates, same equation. Money comes in, life leaks out, and the gap between effort and reward quietly grows. This is not a failure of character, it is a failure of measurement. When the wrong metric is used, even smart, hardworking people end up confused about why their lives feel so constrained despite doing everything they were told would work. The shift did not come from earning more. It came from measuring differently. The belief Ethan had to replace was not about work ethic or ambition. It was about value. The old belief said income was the number that mattered most. The new belief was quieter, but far more powerful. What matters is what remains after the job takes its share. Money is only meaningful in relation to time and energy. A paycheck that consumes your attention, your evenings, and your ability to recover is not generous, no matter how large it looks on paper. When you see work this way, the question changes. Instead of asking, "How much does this job pay?" you start asking, "What does this job leave me with?" This reframing creates relief. It removes the pressure to constantly chase higher numbers and replaces it with clarity. A smaller paycheck that preserves your time, health, and flexibility can be more valuable than a larger one that drains them. The goal stops being maximum income and becomes sustainable margin. Once Ethan adopted this perspective, the fog lifted. His frustration was not a personal failing. It was a mismatch between what he was measuring and what he actually needed. He did not need to work harder. He needed his work to cost less of his life. This belief did not make him anti-work or unrealistic. It made him precise. And precision, more than effort, is what creates freedom. With the new belief in place, the actions became surprisingly simple. The first step was to calculate one honest number, not the advertised rate, not the salary headline. The number that mattered was what Ethan actually kept after everything the job required. Taxes, commuting, work-only expenses, convenience spending driven by fatigue, and the extra hours the job quietly occupied. When he divided what remained by the true time commitment, he finally had a real hourly rate. The second step was to let that number guide decisions, not emotionally, but mechanically. Before spending money, he translated prices into time. A purchase was no longer just a dollar amount. It was an exchange of hours of his life. This single filter slowed everything down. It added friction in a world designed to remove it. The power of this approach was not discipline. It was alignment. When spending reflected the real cost of earning, choices became easier. Many purchases stopped making sense without effort or guilt. The job had already taken enough. There was no need to give it more through unconscious spending. These actions did not require a new budget, a new app, or a dramatic lifestyle change. They required awareness and consistency. And once practiced, they protected time as deliberately as money. The realization settled in slowly, then all at once. Ethan had not been failing at money. He had been using the wrong scoreboard. The constant fatigue, the sense of being behind, the feeling that his life was shrinking despite earning more, all of it made sense once the full cost was visible. Nothing was wrong with his effort. The equation itself had been incomplete. When you begin to see work through this lens, something subtle changes. You stop treating exhaustion as a badge of honor. You stop assuming that higher pay automatically means a better life. You become more protective of your time, not because you are lazy, but because you finally understand its price. This clarity brings calm, not because the system suddenly becomes fair, but because you are no longer confused by it. You can make choices with your eyes open. You can decide what is worth trading your life for and what is not. The most powerful part is that this awareness does not demand perfection. It asks for honesty, and honesty, applied consistently, is enough to shift the trajectory of a life that once felt stuck on autopilot. If this made you look at your paycheck differently, you are not alone. Most people have never been shown how to question work this way, and once the question is asked, it tends to linger. Share this with someone who always looks exhausted but insists they are doing fine. Not as advice, but as an invitation to think. These conversations matter more than tips or tricks because they change how people see their own lives. We are going to keep unpacking the beliefs that quietly shape our financial decisions, one at a time. If you want to keep exploring them together, stay close. Awareness is where freedom starts.